If this is your first time visiting MHS, and I do see some people here I don't think I've seen before, I'd like to offer you a very special welcome. We are an independent nonprofit association, and we are a research library. That's the heart of our enterprise, but we offer weekly programs on all aspects of Massachusetts and American history. We also have continuing education programs for K through 12 educators, and we have 5 series of seminars for academics. Our library, which you're sitting in the reading room of right now, is free and open to the public. And through our library, we offer access to our amazing collections. We have 13 million objects in our collections of manuscripts and objects. Often our public programs feature researchers who have used our collections, so we have a custom of pulling together a small display that touches on the subject of the evening. And I'd like to thank our librarian, Peter Drummy, who put together 2 display cases for the reception that feature items from our collection that relate to the topics touched on tonight. I think it really goes to show the depth of our collections even though our discussion spans 100 years, we always have likely some material related to that topic. We make all of this, by the way, not only access to the library, but collections, exhibitions, and programs available to the public. For the most part, they're free, and we are only able to do that because we have a wonderful set of donors who support us, and we could not do it without them. So I thank those of you who are here, who are supporters, and encourage the rest of you to pick up a little something on the way out and become a member. Thank you. So I'd like to let you know about a couple of logistical issues and then turn the mic over to the program introduction. For you regulars, where's Doris? For you regulars, this program is going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be 1 hour and 15 minutes to 1 hour and a half with questions and answers. So for our regulars, I want to let you know it's a little bit longer. And when we get to the question and answer portion, we're going to ask you to come to a microphone in the middle of the room, and that's really for our guests so they can hear that, your question. I'd like to thank the Mass Humanities Council for a grant that helped us put this program together. And finally, I'd like to thank Claire Nelson. This event came about because of an article Claire read and passed on to us and got the MHS staff talking. And I wanted you to be aware that sometimes our best ideas come from suggestions, and we encourage you, if you have an idea for a program, let us know. So I'm going to just introduce Claire Nelson, who will introduce the panel.
Hi there. Good evening and welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here. As Catherine said, I'm Claire Nelson and I'm a trustee here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And it is my distinct honor to introduce our panelists tonight. From the Black Lives Matter protests and the civil unrest that began in Ferguson, Missouri, to the women's marches that swept the world on January 21st, 2017, 673 marches to be exact, on all 7 continents, including Antarctica, to the student-led Marches for Our Lives, almost 800 of which took place last Saturday, and the protests on Tuesday before the City Council in Sacramento demonstrating against the police shooting of a man who was armed with a cell phone, talking in his grandmother's backyard. It is clear that people are organizing and taking to the streets in ways they haven't done in at least several decades. But their activism, their efforts to change the prevailing discourse about citizenship, its rights, privileges, and responsibilities is not unprecedented. And those precedents extend back beyond the protests of the 1960s, the decade of demonstrations to which they are most often compared, to the earliest years of the American experiment in democratic self-government. Here to explore with us tonight the long-standing relationship between protest and citizenship in America are 4 preeminent historians: Steve Kantrowitz, John Stauffer, Crystal Feimster, and Chad Williams. Stephen Kantrowitz received his PhD from Princeton University and is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a historian of race, politics, and citizenship in the 19th century United States and teaches courses on the Civil War era, slavery, and slave revolts. His second book, More Than Freedom, Fighting for Black Citizenship in a White Republic, 1829 to 1889, showed how Boston's 19th century black activists, in seeking to recast their relationship to the nation, both helped to bring about the Civil War and to bind the policy of slave emancipation to the idea of political equality. His current work explores the dissenting approaches to citizenship of utopian, settler colonial, and white supremacist groups in the era of the 14th Amendment. and he has plans for books on Native Americans, scholars, and Native scholars in post-removal Wisconsin, and on the transformations of American citizenship in the Civil War era through the experience of Wisconsin's Ho-Chunk people, whose struggle to evade removal sheds light on the powerful but uncodified relationship between citizenship and civilization. John Stauffer received his PhD from Yale University and is the Sumner R. and Marshall S. Cates Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. His 19 books include The Black Hearts of Men, Radical Abolitionists and the Transformation of Race, Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and The Battle Hymn of the Republic, a biography of the song that marches on. 2 of his books were national bestsellers, and several have won numerous awards. He is also the author of more than 50 academic articles, and his essays have appeared in Time, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The New Republic, and The Washington Post, among other places. He also has advised 3 award-winning documentaries and has been a consultant for feature films, including Django Unchained, which was released in 2012, and The Free State of Jones in 2016. He teaches courses on protest literature, emancipation, Southern literature, Douglass and Lincoln, the Civil War, autobiography, the 19th century novel, and historical fiction, and is currently working on a biography of Charles Sumner. Crystal Feimster received her PhD from Princeton University and is Associate Professor of African American Studies and American Studies at Yale University, where she is also affiliated with both the History Department and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. Her publications include The Impact of Racial and Sexual Politics on Women's History, which appeared in the Journal of American History in 2012, How Are the Daughters of Eve Punished? Rape During the American Civil War, in Writing Women's History, published by the University of Mississippi Press in 2011, and General Benjamin Butler and the Threat of Sexual Violence During the American Civil War, which appeared in Daedalus in the spring of 2009. Her prize-winning book, Southern Horrors, Women in the Politics of Rape and Lynching, published by Harvard University Press that same year, uses the work of 2 women, journalist Ida B. Wells and lecturer-politician Rebecca Latimer Felton, to examine the roles of both black and white women in the politics of racial and sexual violence in the American South. Wells, in particular, spearheaded national campaigns against lynching, while Felton came to prominence urging white men to assert their manhood by lynching black men accused of raping white women. Despite being on opposite sides of the lynching question, both Wells and Felton sought protection from sexual violence and political empowerment for women. And Southern Horrors is a story that reveals how the complex drama of political power, race, and sex played out in the lives of Southern women. Feimster is currently working on 2 book projects, Sexual Warfare, Rape and the American Civil War, and Truth Be Told, Rape and Mutiny in Civil War Louisiana. Chad Williams is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies at Brandeis University. He earned his PhD in history from Princeton University and specializes in African American and modern United States history, African American military history, the World War I era, and African American intellectual history. His first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I era, was praised as a landmark study and won numerous awards, including the 2011 Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the Organization of American Historians, and the 2011 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History. In the aftermath of the massacre of congregants at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston by white supremacist Dylan Roof, Williams co-edited the Charleston Syllabus, which circulated online among history teachers and faculty and was recently published by the University of Georgia Press as the Charleston Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence. Chad is currently completing a study of W.B. Du Bois and World War I. I can think of no finer historians to guide us through a conversation on the relationship between citizenship and protest in the American past. Please give a warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Claire and Gavin, for getting the ball rolling and coming up with this idea, and to John and Crystal and Chad for agreeing to be part of it. We're going to each talk for 7 to 10 minutes, no more than that, and then we're going to talk to each other, and then you're going to talk to us, and we're going to talk to you and to each other. Okay? So, our theme tonight is protest and citizenship, and I want to start us off almost 200 years ago when free African Americans in Boston began calling themselves colored citizens. That self-description was an act of protest, and it was an act of invention. And to explain what I mean by that, I need to say a few words about the conditions of black freedom in the generations before the Civil War. Put simply, there was much to protest. The Massachusetts Constitution said all men are born free and equal, and slavery died in the 1780s. Black men in Massachusetts were eligible to vote, and many did. But slavery hung like a cloud over black people's freedom and citizenship. So free and equal did not carry with it the equal rights that we attach to those terms today. Black people were barred from most professions and skilled trades. They were excluded from most hotels and restaurants and neighborhoods. They attended segregated schools. They rode in segregated railroad cars. In fact, as some of you may know, the term Jim Crow, as applied to railroad cars, was invented in Massachusetts in the 1840s. White supremacy haunted free black life, not just in the realms of law and the occupations and the trades and public accommodations, but denied them a dignified civic existence. They were chased off the Boston Common when they assembled to celebrate there. Placards and cartoons made fun of them in barrooms and in the streets. The most popular form of entertainment in the day was blackface minstrelsy, and hence the term Jim Crow and other terms like Zip Coon that haunted African American life. When the first African American, just for one example of how attainment didn't save you, when the first African American to try a case before the Massachusetts bar, Robert Morris, approached his opposing counsel to introduce himself, the man literally screamed at him. He was that upset that a black man was presuming to practice law, presuming to enter into this kind of world as his equal. So they were not equal to other citizens, not just in law, not just in practice, but because slavery shadowed their lives. Article 4 of the Constitution seemed to say that the citizens of all the states have the rights of all the citizens of all the states. And if you're a citizen in one state, you're a citizen in all the others. But in fact, for black people, that was not the case. They were haunted both by Negro Sailor Acts in southern states and by the Fugitive Slave Law, which made them susceptible to return to slavery or kidnapping into slavery with little or nothing in the way of what we would consider due process. In other words, when we think about African American life in the 19th century, we must not think of it in progressive terms, as things were always getting a little bit better. And indeed, the arc of history was going the other way. In many states where free black men could vote at the beginning of the 19th century, they could not vote by the Civil War. The crackdown on the rendition and the rescue of fugitive slaves led to a renewed fugitive slave law in 1850 that made black freedom much more precarious throughout all of the United States. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 said essentially black people couldn't be citizens of the United States even if they were citizens of the states where they lived. And the most popular form of anti-slavery activity in the 19th century United States was colonization, which is a polite word for deportation. So all of that taken together, African Americans responded to that by claiming equality through protest. They adopted or invented institutions that proceeded from egalitarian principles, and they used those as platforms to press for an equal place in American life. They first built a counterpublic, a black counterpublic of churches and schools and lodges and literary and burial societies where they could secure their own ends in dignity apart from white people. But they repeatedly and insistently reached out from that counterpublic and insisted on their equal status in the wider world and sought white allies to help them achieve that. They used as their platforms for these appeals the languages that would have been familiar to the people around them. The world of natural rights theory and practice, beginning with the Declaration of Independence, with all men are created equal, and including the Massachusetts Constitution's more expansive vision of that, all men are born free and equal. This led to petitions against slavery and suits against slavery. In fact, slavery ends in Massachusetts because slaves sue for their freedom. That's how it comes to an end. That's why the Supreme Court of Massachusetts rules in the 1780s that there is no more slavery in Massachusetts under its Constitution. They demand better civic treatment, they protest against indignity, and they demand a place in the worldwide brotherhood of Christ. Acts 17, the King James Version they would have been familiar with, says, God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and they take that seriously. And they insist on an equal place in churches, and when that fails, they build their own, and they pursue this in other realms, in the realm of Freemasonry, which I won't belabor here, but is another critically important project that involves a majority of the black activist men of the mid-19th century North. So in all of these ways, they're saying, yes, these are essential truths that are basic to our understanding of ourselves as Americans, given by God, but not only given by God, made real by us. So an Alabama slaveholder comes and testifies before the Massachusetts legislature and says, God will free the slaves in his own time. And they quickly look at the legislators look around and they call up leading black activist in Boston, Lewis Hayden, and have him come up. And Hayden says, yeah, that's true, God will free the slaves in his own time, but he'll do so through the agency of his people, blessed with a free gospel. In other words, freedom and equality through works, through agency. That was their vision of citizenship. In 1829, David Walker gave life to the phrase colored citizens in his pamphlet, Appeal to the Colored Citizens, protesting slavery and colonization and Christian hypocrisy and warning the slaveholders that God was going to wreak judgment upon them. But he also imagined a better world. He said, what a happy country this will be if the whites will listen. And that became the spur for the interracial abolition movement, for the conversion of whites by blacks to an egalitarian view of the United States. And that is what literally set William Lloyd Garrison on his path, what set the Liberator and the New England Anti-Slavery Society and the American Anti-Slavery Society. And as black people were the vanguard of this vision of egalitarian citizenship through protest, they called themselves, throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, colored citizens. What they meant by that was a little different than our kind of legalistic notion of citizenship. They were calling upon an affective, emotional vision, but not only one, not just what a happy country this will be, because David Walker was not that naive, and these activists were not that naive. They knew that this was not just a gift or a matter of love or belonging. It was something you claimed, something you won. And if you wanted to claim the mantle of citizen, you had to offer persistent protests against unequal treatment and demand equality before the law. And therefore, Frederick Douglass's favorite quotation from Byron, hereditary bondmen, know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. And that meant pushing blacks and whites together toward direct confrontation with the slaveholders, not as martyrs, but as militants. It meant freeing fugitive slaves from their captivity. It meant defending others against being captured. It meant spiriting them away to Canada or insisting you defend them where they were in the streets of Boston. So in other words, you had people who were capable of saying, I have here a carefully written petition explaining why unequal treatment is a violation of natural law. We're going to present this to the legislature at the next session, so please sign it and pass it around at the Faneuil Hall meeting tonight, but afterwards, when we get to Court Square, make sure to put it safely in your pocket, because while we're picking up the railroad tie and knocking down the door to the courthouse, you wouldn't want it to fall on the ground. This is petitions for equality and a militant struggle against slavery were two sides of the same coin. They were the same revolutionary activity, and they were revolutionary activity, much like the revolution of the 1770s. If this sounds familiar, the idea that equality and earned through protest, if it sounds familiar to you, in fact, like nearly every protest you've ever attended, it's because the colored citizens of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s established the terms of what protest means for us. And just as their militant insistence on equality continues to define the best of what we mean by citizenship. And in these days of crisis, we're often asked to think about the lessons of history and what they can teach us. And sometimes we're called to embrace Dr. King's moral arc, which is long but bends toward justice, or Seamus Heaney's stirring invocation of its possibilities. In his words, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. But justice, like history, is neither a tidal wave, nor a tendency, nor a moral arc that bends of itself. Justice is deduced by people from their circumstances and given life by their actions, by their protests. At least in part, that's how history is made as well, and that's why protest matters and why the people who call themselves colored citizens still demand our attention. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me. This is a wonderful idea and a wonderful panel and wonderful turnout. Mass Historical Society about a year ago published a collection called The Future of History that was inspired by a colloquium in which several hundred people from all over were invited to discuss the large idea of history and how it could be relevant for individuals in their lives today, regardless of whether or not they were professional historians or not. And I had the great fortune and honor to be present for that and was asked to write a piece. And I borrowed from a course that I have long taught called American Protest Literature, from Tom Paine to Tupac. And the article that I ended up submitting and publishing is based on a number of quotes or near quotes from activists and protesters throughout American history, which is history is the activist's muse. And I firmly believe that. It's the foundation of the course that I have taught. And yet, throughout American history, American culture, scholars have tried to separate, sever, or downplay that relationship between history and activism. In the scholarship, there's a rich tradition, including from colleagues of mine, beginning with Dan Aaron at Harvard, who argue that writers are obsessed with fresh starts. To be original is either a historian or a nonfiction writer or a fiction writer. You need to look forward. You need to think forward, not backward. America, the United States, is a nation of fresh starts. It's still a new world. And yet, when you look at the history of writing, the degree to which men and women of all different genders or all different ethnicities and races, and regardless of where they come from, are drawing from history, inspired by it, and recognizing that the past profoundly shapes their understanding of their present and can shape their future is extraordinary. To such a degree that I often quote Orwell's 1984, a book that since the election of President Trump has achieved a new bestseller status. And Orwell is obsessed with and hated totalitarianism. And one of the main reasons why he hates totalitarianism is because of the use and misuse and flagrant fabrication of history of the past. In fact, the party slogan in the book, and it's a line that it's repeated more than any other line, is this: who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the future controls the present. Now, I think control is too strong of a verb, but change it to shape. Who shapes the past shapes the future. And it is a profound statement. And it is how our understanding of the present and the future has evolved. It's one of my own areas in the Civil War era. You see this extraordinary, self-conscious remaking of the past, such that major figures of the 19th century are truly erased for much of the 20th century. And that leads me to a couple specific examples that I want to provide about the relation between past and present. Two are Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. The reason that I want to focus on them is because their understanding of the importance of their visual public persona. The most recent book I did is on Frederick Douglass and photography. I found out that he is the most photographed American in the 19th century. There are more separate photographs of Frederick Douglass than of any other American in the 19th century. More than of Lincoln, more than of Custer, more than of Twain, more than of anyone else. And I've run the numbers, and you can ask me and I can show you, and the evidence is there. There are a few unknowns, like Grant. No one's added up the archive of Grant. But the larger point, and Sojourner Truth is one of the most photographed women in the 19th century. Douglass and Truth are also hugely admired public speakers, orators, among the greatest male and female orators, respectively, in the 19th century. Douglass, so far as I know, could command a higher speaking fee than any other orator. And this was an age in which public speaking was a bit like being an actor or a movie star or professional television or radio personality. It's one of the few forms of entertainment. And Douglass, for the first 50 years of the 20th century, is essentially out of print. He's the public face of the United States in the 19th century and systematically suppressed. Benjamin Quarles, the great African-American historian, brings Douglass back into print in 1948 with his narrative. My Bondage and My Freedom was his best-selling book. That doesn't come back into print until several decades later. And then Phil Foner, Eric Foner's uncle, publishes The Life and Letters, 5 volumes in 1950, but that's published by the Communist Press, international publishers, which sells like 1,000 copies a year. I mean, it's honestly not until roughly 1990s that Douglass is systematically taught in the classroom. And so Sojourner Truth is still rarely taught in the classroom. And it raises the question of why were they so in love with photography? And there are 3 answers, the most important of which is they recognize the truth value of photography. Photography told the truth. The lens told the truth. Douglass essentially said, even if you put a camera in the hands of a white racist, the lens won't lie. Whereas I can't trust a white using his hand and drawing a sketch or painting. But I can trust the camera. And Sojourner Truth said the same thing in both fashion poses that cast them as activists, as protesters. The standard pose for a man, and it's in the photographic manuals, it taught photographers how to pose men, was to tell men to look up or above or beyond the camera lens, anywhere but into the lens. The idea was you achieve a visionary gaze. And Douglass confronted his viewer staring directly into the lens. He always dressed up. He was immaculate in his expression, in his look. In essence, he sought to out-citizen white citizens at a time in which most whites tried to argue that blacks could not be citizens. And this is someone who, as I've emphasized, was a more effective, more powerful orator. His look and this photographic image was profoundly compelling. There are photographers chased after him, hoping to invite him to sit in their studios. It was a great honor to photograph Douglass for photographers. And his carte de visite photographs were widely circulated and collected in albums, even from people who never knew him. And so this look of staring directly into the camera lens is what one convert to the cause of anti-slavery in 1852 saw this daguerreotype of Douglass and said, he looks majestic in his wrath. And it's a perfect expression of Douglass, majestically wrathful, dressed up as though he is entitled to any of the most powerful or wealthiest places in the country and is an equal to anyone. And Sojourner Truth does the same thing from a perspective of a woman. She's more famous for her photograph than she was for her presence at meetings, which is a big deal because she was such an effective orator. And like Douglass, she always carefully posed herself. She presented herself to the world as a respectable, middle-class, educated woman, a representative American woman who, like Douglass, deserved the right of citizenship and equality. The motto that she puts as the tagline under her carte de visite photo is, I sell the shadow to support the substance, meaning the photograph links her image, her shadow, to the self or to the substance. And she's often photographed with knitting needles and yarn and look closely at some of these carte de visites, I have email me and I'll send you some of them. In the yarn, how the yarn is portrayed in her carte de visite photograph is that the yarn forms a contour of the United States. It's unavoidable. It's clearly the eastern half. You see Maine, you see Florida, you see Texas, which essentially is a message, sending a message that this woman is a symbol of the Union, a symbol of the nation, like Douglas is, and a public face of the nation, which happens to be black, which reflects this importance of multiracial democracy. Now, the reasons for their love of photography is they recognize or they associate it with freedom. Americans had a love affair with photography that surpassed that of every other nation. Portraiture was the main source of the vogue of photography, but it's limited chiefly to the free states. It doesn't circulate in the slave states. One of the reasons is because slave owners recognized the threat that the truth value of photography could highlight the humanity of slaves. And in fact, John C. Calhoun, when he sees an image, an anti-slavery image in The Liberator in 1831, tries to pass a federal law prohibiting the circulation of any image that could be construed as anti-slavery. At the federal level, that's prohibited, but it is, southern states systematically suppress all freedoms of speech, petition, debate, assembly, and press as it relates to critiques of white supremacy or slavery. In the largest sense, and now connected to the present, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth took advantage of the new technologies of their day in much the same way that activists take advantage of the new technologies today, from Twitter and Facebook to cell phone and videos, particularly with Black Lives Matters. With the rise of Black Lives Matters, increasingly African Americans, many have realized that they don't want to leave home without a camera. Why? Because even though at an abstract level we all know that we can distort an image with the camera, we can create multiple exposures, we can solarize, the camera still has this sense of truth value. And by bringing a camera, whether it's still or a video camera with you, you can document what happens. And then in the 20th century, Douglass's and Sojourner Truth's portraits inspired artists to create thousands of murals, sculptures, paintings, prints, drawings, postage stamps, magazine covers, based on the photograph. Their visual legacies protest lynching and segregation. They lobby for civil rights and celebrate black power. They dignify the black body that white Americans have so often tried to destroy, according to Ta-Nehisi Coates in his recent, profoundly influential book. And it's significant, I think, that Douglass, in particular, was a kind of precursor as well of, or anticipates Black Lives Matters, but before that anticipates the Black Panther Party and Black Power in his demand for visibility, for substance, and for self-determinism in his own community. Douglass and other black leaders recognized the importance of taking it upon themselves to police and protect black communities, beginning in the antebellum period and extending into Reconstruction during the terror in the South with Union League clubs as a way to protect each other from white terrorists and seek to achieve self-determinism. Black Lives Matter's leaders self-consciously have borrowed from and defined themselves as building on both the Black Power and the Black Panther movements. And the last point I'm going over, I'll just make about the past resonating with the president is one other aspect of representation that was immensely powerful in the 19th century, in the long Civil War era, that continues, I think, to be powerful today, is in the form of what's known as Southwest humor, that relates to the tall tale, the tough talk, the bombastic confidence man. And it's a form of representation that's based on the parody and imitation, and at its best becomes a burlesque that involves or invokes a certain degree of laughter, and the imitation becomes amusing, and so it reaches a broad audience, but it highlights or exposes the contradictions and the absurdities of culture. Tall tales and confidence men circulate and are most popular and resonant in American culture in those eras in which there are great incongruities, particularly incongruities in which there is a profound separation between the ideal and the real, especially between democratic dreams and social and economic realities. And the great activist, protester using burlesquing Southwest humor in the 19th century is Mark Twain. His masterpiece was Huckleberry Finn, capturing the post-revolutionary movement, the counter-revolution after the end of Reconstruction, in which Twain burlesques or imitates the manner of the confidence man. And in Huckleberry Finn, the con men are Tom Sawyer, he's a con boy, but also the Duke and the Dauphin. And he highlights the degree to which Huck's friendship with Jim depends upon Huck's friendship with Jim depends upon Huck repudiating Tom, the con man. Seeing Tom for what he is, a tough-talking, tall-telling convoy who uses people, notably Jim, for his own fame and status, and is willing to re-enslave him to that end. And one of the most effective forms of protest in our time now draws directly from Twain, and that's Alex Baldwin playing Trump on Saturday Night Live. Thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking the Mass Historical Society for organizing this panel, and particularly Claire and Gavin for your work in pulling this together. Steve for inviting me to join you in this conversation. And okay, I'm going to pull it closer. I don't shout, I'm sorry. But I will try to speak loud. I'm going to go. I also want to just sort of give a shout out to Nell Painter, in part because 3 of us on the panel are her prodigy. We come to Protest and Citizenship via her, and I thought it was appropriate that you mentioned Truth, a life, a symbol. So here in Boston, in a public lecture given in 1833, Maria W. Stewart, a pioneer of black abolitionist and women's rights advocate, invoked black women's demand for sexual justice by asking, "What if I am a woman?" It was a question with profound implications if answered in the affirmative. What would it mean to acknowledge women, especially black women, as full citizens with legal capacity and political consent? If black women were granted not just the rights of life, liberty, and happiness, but of self-sovereignty, then they would also be entitled to the legal protection of those rights. By asking the question, Stewart asserted the essential humanity of black womanhood and called for the inclusion of black women as fully human and autonomous beings, the owners of their own bodies with the ability to withhold consent. Stewart, like many black women, insisted on sexual justice as a natural right. In doing so, black women and their allies influenced the Republican Party's vision of racial equality over the course of the 1850s through the end of Reconstruction. And their radical campaigns for sexual justice, taken together with evolving Republican ideas about legal equality, made possible the emergence of a new sexual citizenship. My scholarship traces black women's resistance to sexual violence during the transition from slavery to freedom and reveals how their claims for sexual justice informed national debates about the meaning of freedom and citizenship. Black women's relentless defense of themselves under impossible circumstances informed not only the anti-lynching discourse espoused by abolitionists, but also influenced the Republican Party's vision of racial equality from the 1850s until the end of Reconstruction. Taken together, black women's radical and often violent campaigns for sexual justice and the Republican ideas about legal equality for free blacks and fugitive slaves reveals the emergence of a new sexual citizenship that culminated during the Civil War when black women gained the right to withhold consent and to legally testify as victims of sexual assault under military law. During Reconstruction, however, during Reconstruction, however, as the Republican governments lost political power in the South, black women lost hard-won rights of legal protection as night riders and Klansmen raped and sexually brutalized black women all over the South. Once again denied their rights to testify and legal protection against white men's sexual assault, black women such as Ida B. Wells turned to the press and organized for sexual justice as a right of citizenship. So in the decades before the Civil War, black women, free and enslaved, with the aid of a few white women, managed to draw national attention to the master slave rape narrative. Their campaigns for sexual justice took on many forms, from written protest to violent resistance. We can think of Harriet Jacobs, we can think of Celia, a slave who killed her master who raped her. We can think about Margaret Garner and her escape across the Ohio River and the murder of her daughter. Together, these women, black and white, challenged the panoply of laws, tradition, and ideas that reinforced white men's sexual power and placed black women outside the legal and moral definition of rape. These were the years in which black women and their allies waged war against slavery and began to imagine a new kind of American citizenship that included black women and every woman's right to withhold consent and to legal protection. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln passed the Lieber Codes, which basically made rape a war crime. And within the Lieber Codes, there were no racial limits on who could bring charges of sexual assault. And black women armed themselves with new legal tools to negotiate a deeply abusive sexual terrain, but one that for the first time admitted that they could be raped in the eyes of the law. In other words, seizing their new rights as wartime citizens, black women demanded legal protection and sexual justice under military law and sought to define freedom and equality in new racial and gender terms. The black women who testified before military courts, court-martials, were among the many former female slaves who mobilized military law in defense of themselves and their new rights as what I call wartime free people. And during Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, black women remained vulnerable to sexual violence and continued to think in legal and political terms about how best to protect themselves. Refusing to accept the racial and sexual politics of the antebellum hierarchy, they defined protection as a right guaranteed. They the antebellum hierarchy that defined protection as a right guaranteed to only elite women, and building on wartime experiences, they sought to broaden notions of female protection by insisting it was a basic right of citizenship. Newly freed black women were unwilling to return to the antebellum sexual and racial status quo that allowed white men to rape and brutalize them with impunity. Indeed, for black women in the South, another war had just begun. As Southern white anxiety about political, economic, and the social meanings of emancipation intensified in the South, different constituencies assembled a convergent set of racial and sexual fantasies that would soon strip black women of their newfound rights. During the overthrow of radical Reconstruction, Southern white men managed to flip the antebellum script of racial and sexual violence. Whereas prior to the war, abolitionists espoused a political narrative that centered on the rape of black women by white men, in the post-war years, Southern white men articulated a political discourse that defined rape as a crime committed by black men against white women. In constructing the image of the black rapist, Southern white men sought to challenge black men's rights as citizens while expanding their sexual power over black and white women. And the portrayal of black men as beastly and unable to control their sexual desires served to justify lynching, segregation, and disenfranchisement. At the same time that the justification of lynchings and the protection for white womanhood allowed for unprecedented violence against African Americans, it also served to terrorize women and place limits on their sexual freedom and political rights. Indeed, by the 1890s, Southern white men had found in the image of the black rapist a powerful political tool for maintaining white supremacy. And while the rape justification of mob violence never cohered with reality, it shaped Southern politics into a cautionary tale for Southern women. Lynching and the threat of rape served as warnings that the New South was a dangerous place for women who transgressed the narrow boundaries of race and gender. In fact, the stories that Southern white men told and used in their white supremacy campaigns both increased and masked violence against black and white women. Still, out of this renewed sexual violence against black women in the South emerged a powerful anti-rape movement led by Ida B. Wells. The publication of Wells' 1892 pamphlet, Southern Horrors, and the emergence of the Black Club Women's Movement marked a renewed campaign on the part of black women for sexual justice. Wells understood what black women had gained in the Civil War and its aftermath and had lost in winning the peace. Yet, like the black women who had fought for freedom before her, Wells insisted on black women's rights as citizens to equal protection under the law. Like Stewart, Wells turned to the press to make her case. In doing so, she provoked the emergence of the Black Club Women's Movement that would carry the campaign for sexual justice well into the 20th century. And I would argue that Anita Hill, who spoke out against Clarence Thomas's sexual harassment, is a part of that longer tradition and narrative of black women making claims for sexual protection and equal protection, sexual justice and equal protection under the law. I would also argue that part of the movement of Me Too comes out of this longer tradition of black women making the case that as citizens that they have a right to protection. And that oftentimes when we think about citizenship, that we forget the ways in which not just black people were excluded from that category, but the ways in which women were excluded from that category. And that the work that black women have often done to make the case for equal protection and how we think about citizenship really opened up conversation for both black people and women to make particular claims. And I'll end there because I think we'll have plenty of time to talk about some of the other links to present movements like Black Lives Matter.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. It's a great pleasure. Again, want to thank Claire and Gavin for organizing this really important event. All my fellow panelists, it's a great honor to back cleanup in this distinguished group of scholars and friends. I'm going to pull us a little bit out of our 19th century hold here and into the 20th century, and hopefully make some connections to the 21st century. So if you didn't know already, this year marks the ongoing centennial of World War I, one of those forgotten wars, oftentimes overshadowed by much bigger conflicts like the Civil War. No shade to my fellow panelists here. World War I was nevertheless a watershed moment in United States history. And there are many reasons why this was the case. We can certainly look at the military significance of the war, its political, cultural, economic significances. We would probably need another event to fully delve into all of that. But for our purposes this evening and for this panel, I think we should really recognize World War I as a pivotal moment in the history of protest and citizenship, and even more specifically, World War I as a pivotal moment in the history of African American protest and citizenship. In July of 1918, W.E.B. Du Bois, born 150 years ago in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard University, co-founder of the NAACP, and at the time of the war, arguably Black America's leading scholar, intellectual, and eloquent voice on the so-called race problem. He wrote an editorial in the Crisis magazine, which he edited, an editorial entitled "Close Ranks." For nearly 4 years, the war had been raging, but 1918, Du Bois predicted, would be, in his words, the great day of decision. And he wrote in his editorial, "We of the colored race have no ordinary interest in the outcome. That which the German power represents today spells death to the aspirations of Negroes and all darker races for equality, freedom, and democracy. Let us not hesitate. Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks, shoulder to shoulder, with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly with our eyes lifted to the hills." Perhaps more than any other editorial in Du Bois's long distinguished career, Close Ranks captured the tension between protest and citizenship for African Americans, a tension that still remains very much alive and well today. 100 years ago, during the time of the First World War, citizenship mattered for African Americans. I think it's very important to emphasize that. Even in the midst of segregation, disfranchisement, debt peonage, convict leasing, horrific racial violence, the degradation of the citizenship status of African Americans, they did not forget that they were indeed citizens. Du Bois and many other African Americans therefore approached the World War as both a test of their citizenship and an opportunity to bring effective meaning to it. Just as they had in previous wars, the most significant, as has been highlighted, the Civil War, African Americans would demonstrate their loyalty and affirm their citizenship by sacrificing on and off of the battlefield. 100 years ago, protest also mattered. From the start of American entry into the war in April of 1917, most Black people accepted the fact that in doing their civic duty to the nation had a reciprocal obligation to treat Black people as full and equal citizens. African Americans would be loyal and patriotic, but they also demanded their rights, the most basic, as Crystal has emphasized so eloquently, being safety and protection. So let me offer one vivid example of how this played out during the war. The East St. Louis massacre brutally demonstrated the lack of safety and protection afforded to black citizens. On July 2nd, 1917, white mobs unleashed a fury of violence against the city's black community. The pogrom left entire neighborhoods in ashes, over 6,000 black residents homeless, and well over 100 men, women, and children dead. In response, on July the 28th, the NAACP organized a silent protest parade in New York City. Nearly 10,000 African Americans, the men dressed in all black, the women and children dressed in all white, signifying respectability, dignity, somberly marched down Fifth Avenue to the sound of muffled drums. They carried signs that read, "Your hands are full of blood. We have fought for the liberty of white Americans in 6 wars. Our reward was East St. Louis. Patriotism and loyalty presuppose protection and liberty. Make America safe for democracy." Du Bois, impeccably dressed with his walking cane in hand, was at the front of the march. It's important to remember that black protest has always been forced to confront efforts to control and eliminate it, from white citizens and the federal government alike. In his April 2nd, 1917 war address, President Woodrow Wilson promised, and I quote, "If there should be disloyalty, it will be dealt with a firm hand of stern repression." The Espionage Act of 1917 made it a crime punishable by up to 20 years in prison to, quote, "interfere with the operation or success of the armed forces of the United States or to promote the success of its enemies." African-American socialist leader and future organizer of the March on Washington, 1963, A. Philip Randolph, was actually arrested for distributing copies of his radical newspaper, The Messenger, but he actually escaped conviction because the white judge believed that no Negro could be smart enough or savvy enough to publish an intellectually sophisticated newspaper like The Messenger. Yeah. The Espionage Act was strengthened the following year by the Sedition Act, which severely curtailed freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The government's military intelligence division spent countless hours investigating potential Negro subversion. As editor of The Crisis and himself under government surveillance, Du Bois fully recognized that protests carried tremendous risk. His editorial closed ranks was therefore, on the one hand, a pragmatic decision, but it also reflected the genuine belief that African Americans were first and foremost Americans, that their principal duty as citizens was to their nation. Win the war now, protest later. Having demonstrated beyond reproach that they were indeed loyal, patriotic citizens, rights would inevitably be forthcoming. So, how did the vast majority of African Americans respond to Du Bois's advice? They were stunned. Under no circumstances, most argued, should African Americans forget their special grievances. To the contrary, the war demanded that they fight and protest for their rights even more vigorously. Du Bois's harshest critics branded him a traitor to the race. Du Bois would in fact spend the rest of his life second-guessing his decision to support the war and regretting his advice for African Americans to close ranks with their fellow white citizens. He recognized that so long as race and the color line remained the central feature of American life, closing ranks around a romanticized ideal of citizenship was impossible. I believe that remains true today. In some ways, the error of Du Bois's judgment was borne out in World War II, as black people explicitly called for a double V, victory against fascism abroad and victory against white supremacy at home. That means my time is almost up here, huh? If it were not for the protests of the World War II era, the evolution of the modern civil rights movement would have likely looked much different. So 100 years after World War I, there are still some people who say that black people as American citizens first and foremost should close ranks and forget their special grievances. That protest, especially when it hits the sensitive nerves of loyalty and patriotism, is inappropriate. My response to that is that protest, as has been emphasized, is the most powerful expression of citizenship and remains absolutely necessary for bridging the gap between citizenship as an ideal and as a lived reality. And I'm also convinced, even though he may have been wrong 100 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois would agree with me today. Thank you.
So I assume we have a little bit of time to talk about what's just happened before we go to Q&A. Is that right? Is that all right, Gavin? 5 minutes. Okay. Can I just raise one question that occurred to me as y'all were talking that I thought might be worth thinking about? And that's, it goes most directly from what you just had to say, Chad, but I think it covers the waterfront here. And that is, on one level, war and protest and militancy are agents of social change. On the other hand, we also know that they are devastating producers of rape and assault and murder, and of the violation of civil liberties by states and by individuals. So, you know, the hereditary bondmen, know ye not who would be free themselves must strike the blow, cuts a bunch of different ways. And in fact, in that moment, in the 1840s and 50s, radical abolitionists knew it. Paulina Davis, a white abolitionist at the Women's Rights Convention, 1851, says, that is a barbarous principle. You're not free because you strike the blow. Where did that idea come from? And, you know, when war's gendered male, of course, a radical woman's going to have that perspective, right? She says, no, these rights, if they're truly natural rights, they're natural rights. You shouldn't have to kill for them. I wonder how this fits into our understandings of the protest tradition.
Folks are looking at me. Yeah, I've really been fascinated with the correlation between war and protest, because I think in many ways you can trace the long arc of the Black freedom struggle through moments of war, even beginning with the American Revolution, certainly continuing throughout the Civil War, World War I, as I study World War II, even thinking about the Vietnam War, and even our current military conflicts in their various forms today. I think war unsettles the social and political order in profound ways and creates spaces and opportunities for African Americans and other marginalized groups to assert their citizenship in very deliberate and explicit ways, probably the most significant being through military service, right? The civic obligation of military service, and the argument that if you put on the uniform, right, as Frederick Douglass talked about, there's no way that the nation can deny you your rights as citizens. And that has been a very powerful force, and has been, I think, a very powerful force for change, especially when we think about the role of soldiers and veterans in movements for citizenship rights and social justice. But at the same time, Steve, as you said, it has also created these moments of intense repression as well, which is an important part of that story. And I think it is important to recognize that, you know, war is not the answer, right? But it has served as an important opportunity at the same time.
And for women in the South, in the Civil War, we know that the rights of citizens are, in some ways, are suspended on the ground when war is being waged. Yet, in the context of the Civil War, with the Lieber codes, there's a new kind of modern rules of warfare that set out actually to protect citizens in many ways, right? And for Black people and Black women in particular, these new laws allow them to challenge some of that brutality of war, right? So Black women who are bringing rape charges are usually women who've been raped by white Union soldiers, right? Also, what we see is, and you know, when black men join the military, there's this kind of understanding that you're giving up your kind of right as a citizen when you join the military, that you're a soldier, and what that means. And we see black soldiers pushing up against those contradictions, right? And when we look at mutinies, for example, during the Civil War, what you see is black people protesting, black men particularly protesting what they see as their rights as citizens being violated, whether that's being flogged or being denied sort of the same rights that white soldiers are allowed. And oftentimes there's an argument that black men don't understand the rights of freedom or citizenship because they're actually trying to challenge some of the unjust realities of what it means to serve in the military and not wanting to give up their new rights as citizens. So there are these kinds of contradictions where you see black people sort of, I always feel like pushing, I always say what's good for black people is good for everybody, people. So when black people are protesting, it may for some people feel like it's a unique, special right that they're trying to claim, but it's a right that usually when it's expanded and understood as a right of all citizens, it sort of raises all boats, right?
Yeah.
I would just add to this that most black abolitionists, certainly, and arguably most abolitionists, define slavery itself as a state of war. And slavery was warfare between master and slave. That's essentially, I'm paraphrasing Frederick Douglass. You read most of the slave narratives, and that's a central theme in the slave narrative, is that slavery is a state of war. And so when the nation state ends up engaging in warfare, in the case of the Civil War, against slave states that have seceded, every African American recognizes this golden opportunity long before the Lincoln administration does, that this is an opportunity to end slavery. That preserving the Union is inseparable from emancipating slaves and freeing them. So that relationship between slavery and war and the nation state of war and war is important. The second point I'll make is that William Cooper Nell, who born and bred in Boston, he's becomes part of the vigilance community in the north end of Beacon Hill. Close friend of Charles Sumner. He published one of the first full histories of African Americans, colored patriots in the American Revolution, which is really it traces the history of African Americans. And the central question and theme is the degree to which the United States military had served as an important marker for African Americans and a symbol of citizenship. Until the 14th Amendment, the question of citizenship was widely debated in the United States. So Roger Taney in the Dred Scott decision infamously said, blacks can never be and have never been citizens. And yet, the two symbols of citizenship that most, certainly Northerners, agreed on is that if you served in the United States military, you were a citizen. And if you received a U.S. passport, you were a citizen. And there's precedent from that in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. And William Cooper Nell documents that. And in fact, I've argued in a recent essay that Mass Historical Society, based on a conference in Mass Historical Society, and it published that Nell was hugely influential at, his history was hugely influential at convincing Lincoln to alter the final Emancipation Proclamation to call for the arming of blacks, recognizing and using blacks in the military as soldiers, recognizing that that's a symbol of citizenship. It's a dramatic, truly almost revolutionary shift from the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which advocates colonization and says nothing about arming blacks as soldiers and citizens. And thereafter, The United States military has functioned as one of the most sought-after organizations for African American men in particular, and with the opening up for women as well. In fact, to this day, the United States Army is one of the only major institutions in the United States in which the ratio of enlisted men, black enlisted men, and black officers is the exact same as the ratio of white enlisted men and white officers, which means that the United States military, if you're African American, you have as much of a chance of being promoted to officer status as if you're white. And that is, I mean, so far as I know, there's not another major institutional organization in the United States like that.
That's right.
So you're absolutely right about what you say about the, war is hell, war is bad. But remember the long history, not just of African Americans, of activists, of protesters saying slavery is a state of war, but so is Jim Crow segregation.
That's right. Yeah.
So is Jim Crow segregation, so is mass incarceration. So they're all dependent upon violence or the threat of violence. And so there is a continuity.
Can we take some questions?
Women have made huge changes in societal structure. Gays and lesbians have made huge changes in societal structure. And I cry over the fact that we have not come farther. In fact, maybe we've gone a little bit backward, other than the elite few who become PhDs and engineers and leaders in the military.
So we only have a couple more minutes for questions. So
That wasn't much of a question.
Right.
It was a statement that 50 years, what are we going to do in the next 50 years?
That's a big question. Yeah. Yeah.
Protest.
So well, just one super quick answer to that question is 50 years. Yeah, you can look at 68 and you look at 2018. It's not like nothing changed between 1968 and 2018. Lots of things changed for better and for worse because of policy and because of the successful or unsuccessful protest of those policies. So schools were as segregated in 1968 as they are today, but they were less segregated than 1988, right? So that didn't happen by accident. That happened because of policy, and that happened because of protest and counter-protest. And we can never forget the most successful protest movement of the present day is the backlash against racial equality, right? That's what we're living in. That's where we are. So I think we need to take account of history happens because people make it happen. Not only, but crucially. Sorry, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, your comments made me, again, think about Douglass immediately after the war, and one of the things that he said is, you freed us, and now leave us alone, right? So I think oftentimes when we think about the history of citizenship and protest, there's this automatic kind of correlation between civil rights and integration. And in some ways, the full affirmation of citizenship will be, or perhaps should be, the right for African Americans to be able to be left alone, right? To be able to make the choice that if we want to go back to our own neighborhood, then we have the right to do that, right? So I think, while integration is certainly important, and the right to integration is important, I think it's also important to recognize the significance of autonomy and self-determination as well.
Which Doug,
yeah.
I have a quick question. Because somebody brought this up earlier. In this era of fake news, we talked about the suppression of history. And when you think of Frederick Douglass, agitate, 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 to how he sort of was taught, in the 60s and 70s, what leads to that sort of suppression, and how can we make sure that sort of fake history, like fake news, doesn't continue to perpetuate itself.
So, I mean, you could use Douglas as an example. I mean, so there are ways that you can document your sources and have a certain transparency so it makes it very easy for people to check sources and follow them. That in the 19th century, in certain respects, the 19th century is closer to our own moment right now, in which there weren't as many official channels of dissemination.
I was just going to say policy matters
Policy
here.
matters, yeah,
Until the early
absolutely.
1980s, we had something called the Fairness Doctrine,
Yeah.
right? When you articulated the point of view on TV or on the radio, there had to be an opportunity for an alternate point of view to be next to it. As soon as that was abolished in the Reagan era, we got the rise of shock jocks and right-wing talk radio and Fox News. And now the whole news ecosystem is organized around people talking to themselves and to their chosen demographics without regard to any form of reliability or verifiability. It's policy matters. Elections matter.
You've actually probably started to address the question I was going to ask, but how historically have people dealt with that moment, that time after the protest kind of seems to succeed, hits the crest, and goes back down again when the repression falls down on it? Say, for example, when you have, after the Civil War, after the end of slavery, the institution, to steal the title of a book, of slavery by another name and unchecked sexual and racial violence. When, after the Civil War, Pitchfork Ben Tillman in South Carolina begins his political career slaughtering armed black men in uniform. Or after World War I, when for a black man, especially in the southern states, a veteran to put on that American uniform and march in a parade is risking his life and practically bringing down a death sentence. How do people respond to that? How do you keep the protest going? And while I am in uniform, I'll leave it to other people to determine whether that question may be applicable to our current situation or not.
You educate and cultivate the younger generation, the new generation. That's what the abolitionists did. Many of them in following the success of the counter-revolution. So Frederick Douglass in his second edition of Life and Times in 1892, 3 years before he dies, he says, I feel like I'm at the beginning of the anti-slavery movement. I feel like I'm starting it all over again. And I'm not a young man anymore. And I don't have the energy that I used to. And what's the solution? We need to be vigilant about cultivating, educating the young generation. And that's what he focused on. The best example is, and Douglas is, world famous, and there are numerous young people who made pilgrimages to his home, sought out his advice. And one young man knows he's speaking in New Bedford and makes a pilgrimage to see him in New Bedford, and he's 21 years old, and he's ambitious and very smart and incredibly hard worker, and he has a private interview with Douglas. Douglas writes about this, and he says, I need your advice. I want to know what you think is the most important thing I should do with my life. Is it best for society to be a doctor or a lawyer or businessman or banker or teacher or educator? What do you think I should do? Douglas says, agitate, agitate, agitate.
And I would argue that even in those moments where it seems like, we've accomplished or won something, it's not like people stop organizing or stop fighting or oftentimes people think of, 64 or they think of 68 as sort of these, there may be these peaks, but just like white supremacy keeps evolving and remaking itself and coming up with new ways to deny people their basic rights, activists, whether it's African Americans or women, are constantly campaigning and fighting and insisting on those rights. We have to be more creative. Our strategies have to evolve, right? Our protest strategies have to evolve. That this is dynamic, the sort of give and take, because the backlash, we often see it as a backlash, but as John said, this was war. It was war before the Civil War. It was war after the Civil War. That Confederates didn't just say, "Oh, we lost the war. Let's be done." Right? They found new ways to deny black people their rights, and black people had to find new strategies, whether it was legal strategies or what have you. And that's what we have to do now, that we have to think about what is our strategy, what's the end game, right? And women have to do it around abortion rights, right? So I just think just because we're not in a moment of triumph doesn't mean that after we hit some benchmarks, it doesn't mean that that people are just sitting on their loins and going, okay, well, we've done that. I think sometimes we're not paying attention, and because they're not these huge victories. People are working on the local level every day, grassroots organizations all the time. They might not be on the news. When you see Black Lives Matter, small organizations all over the country were doing this work before you were thinking about Black Lives Matter. So it's about paying attention and being involved and engaged in your communities, because people are doing this work and have been doing it.
Crystal, you wrote so beautifully about Ida Wells, who spent her whole life not winning, and yet representing all of those struggles, right?
Hello. I have a question. How does this, in your point of view, from your point of view, reflect the struggle between the capitalist class, and the white working class, and black working class? And I think there's a political tangle here that's right in front of our noses that most of us can't see. And I think that's what's behind it. But I want to hear what you and other folks have to say about that.
So oh, wow. We got to, okay, so American History 101. Let's start with where American History 101 should start, which is the creation of race is the creation of a system of exploitation, right? That's what it's for, that's how it happens, and it is intimately related with the creation of what we call class. It is inextricable from it in American history, and we're still living in the aftermath of it. When we get out from under it, we'll know, but we're not there, right? And none of the victories we're talking about have gotten us. They've taken us some steps along the way of that victory, but we are still living in a post-emancipation society, really.
Thank you for coming and talk to us today. My question is, I guess, rooted in results and tactics in winning justice. And in the context of the talk about citizenship and whether the choice to accept citizenship and working maybe within the system to try and win, as was talked about as Frederick Douglass dressing up as the best citizen to show that he is a citizen and winning rights that way, or maybe later in the 60s of not accepting citizenship at all, and working outside the system because the system is corrupt and we don't want to have anything to do with it. And understanding history is understood in the context of the time, and in our time, how do you feel about the present day about working within the system or stepping outside of the system in terms of what you guys know about history and what you guys know about failures and successes about our time today, and sort of those two, opposing.
Well, I don't think it's an either-or question. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I could point to someone like Du Bois, who during World War I felt that it was possible to work within the system to make change. While at the same time you had individuals like Ida B. Wells and William Monroe Trotter, who were working very much outside of the system to effect change. So the two go hand in hand. I think that's been true throughout the history of Black protest, and it is still very much true today.
I think that might be the right place to leave us. Thanks all.